After World War II ended, it was only a matter of time until we were involved in the next one. This one's called the Cold War. Given what happened at Yalta, the death of Roosevelt, and Truman's decision, some say this war was inevitable. Here are our essential questions for this unit. Was the Cold War inevitable? Is there anything that could have been done prior to 1945 to keep this from happening? Was containment an effective policy to thwart communist expansion? Containment is the policy of President Truman. As we'll see, his goal was to contain communism where it already existed and not to let it spread. So you've all heard the phrase, the Iron Curtain. Unfortunately, several years ago, I had a student who thought it really was a curtain made out of iron. But it is a symbol of the division between Eastern and Western Europe. If you think about the decision that General Eisenhower made to have the American soldiers stop at the Elbe River instead of going into Berlin, in hindsight, perhaps that was a mistake because the Soviets were able to sweep into Berlin. And though they had promised free and open elections, in a matter of months, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other Eastern European countries were under the Soviet boot, for lack of a better word. In March of '46, former Prime Minister Winston Churchill visited a small college that none of you will apply to, Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, and he gave a speech in which these words were said. Press the clip there. It's about a minute and a half, and then we'll continue. This speech said, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." And if you think of what this means, it means nobody can get in, but it also means nobody can get out, subject to a very high and increasing measure of control from Moscow. So over the next few years, even though these Eastern European countries would elect their own leaders and make their own decisions, they were very much in the Soviet Union's hand, and Moscow controlled everything that they did. Germany itself, if you look at this map, was divided into two. The Iron Curtain goes right down the middle of former Germany. Parts of Poland were now given to the USSR. If you remember, Germany had been divided into quadrants. That would remain for a couple of years. And if you look at Yugoslavia, that's darker green in the map because they had a communist government, but they were not subject to any influence from Moscow. They were pretty much their own. So our allies became, once again, France, Netherlands, England, Italy this time, Austria, and everything else is the communist side, almost literally dividing Europe in half. So what does containment mean? The former U.S. ambassador to the USSR, a man by the name of George Kennan, composed a telegram known as the Long Telegram. He had been in the USSR during the 30s and the 40s and saw the terrible conditions that the Soviets lived under, the oppression of the people, and wrote a telegram to President Truman, forever known as the Long Telegram because it had so many words in it, saying that we must work against communism. He did not advocate going to war. He did not advocate trying to overthrow Stalin, but all our foreign policy efforts must be in place to make sure that communism didn't spread any farther than it already had. What does this mean? How are people going to resist communism? Europe was suffering badly. They didn't have enough food, they didn't have enough housing, their military was in disarray. As in World War I, we were the only country that emerged from this conflict in a better situation than what we were in at the beginning. Even though the United States lost hundreds of thousands of men during this war and spent millions and millions of dollars, except for Pearl Harbor, no part of the American homeland had been touched. So in order to help Europe rebuild itself, we were going to have to give economic and military aid to every country trying to resist communism. This is what was suggested by George Kennan. The first time this policy was put to the test occurred in Greece and Turkey. Take a look at that video clip there and then come back. You'll see within Greece and Turkey there was a very strong movement of the Communist Party within those countries, and we gave aid to both of them in order to put it down. The official policy of the United States became this containment policy, which lasted up until about 1990, 1991. The Cold War lasted about 40 years. And as I mentioned to you guys in class, the benefit of it was the Olympics, when we enjoyed seeing the Soviet and East German women swimmers come out with their incredibly big muscles, and we could really boo the communist countries because it was very much seen as good versus evil. So that Iron Curtain was literally behind there. Americans could not go. When I went to Europe in 1982 and backpacked with my friends, it was Western Europe. My children had been able to go to countries like the Czech Republic and Berlin in Germany, and places that were not open for 40 years. So the containment policy marks the beginning of the Cold War. So what did Truman say? Here are his exact words. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free people to seek out their own destinies in their own ways. So let's break this down. Free peoples would mean, oops, let me go back for a minute. People who do not want to be communist, people who do not want to be under the boot of the Soviet Union. Oops, I'm going back again. Armed minorities could be, as in Greece and Turkey, groups of usually young people who think that communism is the way to go. Outside pressures could certainly, and was certainly, the Soviet Union pushing these countries to become communist. The second part of this statement, we must assist free people to seek out their own destinies in their own ways. Now notice he doesn't say we will help militarily, we will help economically. He doesn't say what their own destinies are, and it can take many different forms. Okay? So as of 1947, the Truman Doctrine is the explanation of containment. Now you remember when we looked at doctrines before, Stimson Doctrine, Monroe Doctrine, a doctrine is really just a piece of paper unless you put your weight behind it. And that's going to be the question that Truman and future presidents will have to answer. At what point do we militarily get involved? President Kennedy will have to make that decision with Cuba, and President Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon will have to make that decision for Vietnam. Oops, I went back. Sorry. So one of the ways that we chose to help them resist communism became known as the Marshall Plan. You remember General Marshall? He was the chief of staff during World War II, and had we seen more of Saving Private Ryan, he would be the only real character in that movie. He became Secretary of State after the war was over, and in 1947 he took a trip to Europe and had seen abject poverty and horrible misery, with people living in the streets and hunger and just epic sadness. So he came up with a plan that he presented to President Truman, which in 1947 dollars, we can only imagine what it would cost today. There was $16 billion should be given to all of Europe. So what would the goals be for this money? Undoubtedly, it would be to help people eat, help rebuild housing, hospitals, schools, roads. But if you were in front of me right now, somebody would raise their hand and they would say the money was used to help Americans, help Europeans resist communism. The Soviets were asked if they wanted to get involved in this program, and they refused. Instead, they said they would do it on their own. So let's look at some of these reasons. Economic recovery would help Western Europe resist communism. It would create a demand for U.S. exports. The United States would take those factories that had produced weapons, ships, planes, guns, etc., and they converted them to making consumer items such as refrigerators, cars, etc. And now, if the Europeans had money, they could then buy our exports. Another reason, it would create a stronger European economy that we hoped would be similar to ours, an American-type capitalist economy rather than an organized state Soviet-type communist economy. The last point of these four is that Germany has to be rebuilt, and we'd rather have it built the way that we want it to be built rather than the way the Soviet Union wants it to be built. We want to avoid the mistakes of World War I. We want to avoid the situation that allowed somebody like Hitler to come to power. So take a look at this video that will show you the Marshall Plan in action. One of the most expensive ideas ever conceived, but arguably the Marshall Plan saved Western Europe from becoming a satellite of the Soviet Union. For his efforts, General Marshall was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953. We're going to stop here today. Make sure you look at those videos. Make sure you do the follow-up homework, and we'll be back with some more Cold War information soon.